So in this video I'm going to talk about 3 divinatory, occult, magical systems that I work with. And they are the tarot, the runes, and the Ogham. Now, the runes are of Norse, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon origin, and I use this because on my father's side I am of a Norse, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon origin. And the Ogham script is of Irish origin. And on my mother's side I am of Irish origin. So these two divinatory occult systems in particular match my own ancestral blood lineages, and that makes me have a very, very deep connection with them and a very great understanding of them. I also work with the tarot, and the reason why I work with this is because I was introduced to it from a very young age, so it's always been quite a, you could say, big part of my life, and I've worked with it and it's helped me spiritually develop, particularly in my earlier years of practicing magic and shamanism and such. So I'm going to read information on these systems, and then I'll go into my analysis of what I think of them. So I'll start with the tarot. A deck of 78 cards that comprise the most popular divinatory tool in a modern occultism. The tarot is indispensable in many current systems of occult theory and practice. Aside from its use as a divinatory method in which cards are dealt out from a shuffled deck and interpreted in various ways, the tarot is also used as a subject for meditation, a focus for scrying, and a convenient symbolic alphabet in many different branches of occult practice. Its role is a fairly recent one, however, and as little as 200 years ago it was essentially unknown to most occultists. The tarot deck consists of 3 groups of cards. First are 22 trumps, or major arcana, each of which has a number, a title, and a traditional image. Second are the 40 small cards, or pip cards, 10 cards, each of 4 suits, wands or staves, cups, swords, and coins, discs, or pentacles, which correspond to the pip cards of an ordinary playing card deck. Last are the 16 court cards, the king, queen, knight, and page or servant of each suit, which correspond to the face cards of the ordinary deck. Well over 1,000 different tarot cards have been designed and produced over the last few hundred years. Many variations of name, number, and imagery have arisen, especially among the trumps. The most enigmatic and symbolic rich part of the deck, the numbers and titles of the trumps in most modern occult tarot decks, are as follows. The older decks tend to have little in the way of occult symbolism, which the more recent decks are often loaded with it to the bursting point. For instance, the Magician in older decks is generally called the Juggler or the Montebank and stands behind a random assortment of junk on a plank table, while most newer decks equip the Magician with an altar topped with the wand, cup, sword or dagger, and pentacle of the well-equipped ceremonial magician. Behind these changes lies the complex history of the tarot itself. According to occult history, which has embroidered a rich fabric of fantasy around the subject, the tarot originated in ancient Egypt, and the word tarot itself is from the supposed ancient Egyptian words tar, road, and rush, or rog, meaning royal. This claim was introduced by French scholar Antonin Court de Gébelin in a widely popular book on ancient Egypt, published in 1781, and it has been repeated in books on the tarot ever since. Unfortunately, Court de Gébelin wrote more than 40 years before the Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered, and his ancient Egyptian terms came out of his own head. The ancient Egyptian words for road and royal are actually west or Nissa, respectively, to judge by the standard modern dictionaries of Egyptian hieroglyphics. In fact, neither tar nor rog nor rush are ancient Egyptian words at all. The word tarot is simply the French version of the older Italian name Toracchi or Tarocco, a Renaissance slang term of unknown meaning before the 1500s. The tarot deck was called Trumphus, or trumps. Similar problems surround the other two common occult theories about the origins of the tarot, that it was invented and brought to Europe by the gypsies on the one hand, and that it was created by a convention of occultists meeting in the city of Fez, Morocco in 1300s. The first theory falls victim to the fact that the tarot was in circulation in Italy well before the first gypsies arrived there. The second theory simply has no evidence whatsoever to support it. While it cannot be disproved, the convention might just possibly have taken place in such secrecy that no scrap of evidence remained for historians to find. The same sort of argument can be used to prove that the tarot was invented on Mars and reached Earth by way of flying saucers. The actual history of the tarot begins in Renaissance Italy, in the beginning of the 15th century. Around the middle of the previous century, playing cards had first been imported from the Arabic world and had found an enthusiastic welcome among European gamblers. The deck introduced to Italy had the same number of suits, pip cards, and face cards as a modern deck. Though it lacked a joker, its suits were wands, cups, swords, and coins. Still the standard suit marks in traditional Italian decks. The clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds, standard in English-speaking countries, are a later French invention, and still another set of suits are standard in Central Europe. At some point in the first decades of the 15th century, someone at the dual courts of Milan or Ferrara, possibly Marazzino da Tortona, secret secretary to Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, came up with the idea of adding further cards to the deck. In the card games of the time, trick-taking games ancestral to bridge and pinochle, these additional cards made play more lively by enabling players to trump any of the four ordinary suits. A deck devised by Marazzino da Tortona, probably before 1418, is described in a surviving letter. It had 16 trump cards that featured a collection of classical pagan gods. There were many other versions, though none has yet been proved to be earlier than Morosino's by the 1440s. However, something closer to the later tarot deck was becoming standard, and by 1450 and probable date of the Great Pierpont Morgan Bergamo deck, the most complete of the early hand-painted decks, the number, names, and approximate order of the trumps had been more or less established. It deserves to be pointed out that all the available evidence for these early tarot decks indicates that they were meant to be used in card games. The first references to tarot divination date from centuries later. As the game tarot proved highly popular, it spread from Italy to France and Switzerland in the early 16th century, and from there to most of Europe by the beginning of the 17th century and the middle of the 16th century, according to one source. Tarot was more popular than chess in France. Cartomancy itself seems to have begun in the middle or 18th century, and ordinary playing cards of various kinds were used. The first efforts at tarot divination apparently took place in Bologna, Italy, where a specialized tarot deck, the Torco Bologna, of 62 cards had become standard. A manuscript from before 1750 gives divinatory meanings for 35 of the cards. This has little influence on later occult interpretations of the tarot, however. The occult tradition of the tarot has its origins in the writings of Antoine Court de Gebelin, the French scholar whose imaginary Egyptian terminology was mentioned above, a Freemason, a founding member of the deeply esoteric Philadelphus organization, and probably a member of Martinez de Pasquale, Alice Corns as well. He was deeply involved in the Paris esoteric scene. His magnum opus, Le Monde Primitif, The Primitive World, published in 9 volumes between 1773 and 1782, argued that all modern languages, religions, and cultures were the descendants of the high culture of a primordial golden age, which he identified with ancient Egypt. In an essay in the 8th volume, he identified the tarot as an ancient Egyptian book, communicating secret teachings in the form of hieroglyphic emblems. Court de Gebelin's assertions were quickly taken up by Attilia, who had previously published a book on divination with the common 32-card Piquet deck. This book, published in 1770, referred in passing to divination with les tarots. Attilia had perhaps heard of the Bolognese tradition. In 1782, the year that Court de Gebelin's essay on the tarot saw print, Attilia wrote a book on divination of tarot cards. Barred from publication that year by the royal censors, it was resubmitted under a different title the next year and passed muster. Therefore, Attilia produced a series of books on the subject, enlarging the Egyptian mysteries of the tarot and the use of the cards in divination. In the process, he pioneered the relation of tarot and astrology and invented the phrase "the Book of Thoth" as a title for the deck. He established an organization, the Sociedad de Interpretes du Livre de Thoth, Society of Interpreters of the Book of Thoth, to pass on his teachings, and his students and successors were important figures in the Paris occult underworld for half a century after his death. Despite all these previous contributions, it was Ephilus Levi, the architect of the 19th century occult revival, who ensured that the tarot would become one of the core elements of modern occultism. He did this by noticing that the number of major arcana, 22, was equal to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet, one of the essential elements of the Kabbalah, and by using this fact to fuse tarot and the Kabbalah so thoroughly that magicians ever since have seen the two as a unity. Levy's great book, Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, was structured along the lines of his Kabbalistic tarot fusion. For example, the two parts each had 22 chapters, each which dealt with matters suggested by joint symbolism of the respective Hebrew letter and tarot trump. The enormous popularity of Levy's books inserted the study of the tarot family into the occult systems of the 19th century. The cards were taken up by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the most influential of the all magical orders of the period, and became central to the entire Golden Dawn system of magical theory and practice. The Golden Dawn reworked Levy's approach to the tarot, changing the attributions of the Hebrew letters to the trumps. Levy had assigned Alpha, the first letter, to Trump 1, the Magician, and placed the Fool, Trump 0, just before the universe at the end of the sequence, while the Golden Dawn moved the Fool to the beginning and assigned Alpha to it. The Golden Dawn also massively expanded and systemized the symbolism of the deck, creating what has become the standard modern approach to the subject, and redesigned a number of the cards. While the Golden Dawn's own secret tarot deck remained unpublished until the late 20th century, two decks inspired by it played a major role in launching the 20th century craze for tarot cards. The first was designed by Golden Dawn alumnus Arthur Edward Waite and painted by Pamela Coleman Smith, a professional artist who belonged to Waite's branch of the Golden Dawn. Published by Ryder and Co. in 1909, it became known as the Rider-Waite Tarot and went on to become the most popular tarot deck of the modern period. Waite has encountered a late 15th century tarot deck, the Solar Bosca deck, which had symbolic illustrations on all 78 cards. Most other decks simply use different numbers of the suit signs to mark the small cards. The Six of Swords, for example, in most older decks has 6 swords in it, and little or nothing else, borrowing the Solsa Busca concept, and in many cases the individual designs as well. Waite and Smith produced a deck that could be interpreted entirely on the basis of its visual images. This proved enormously popular, and most modern tarot decks have used the same approach. The second influential deck, inspired by the Golden Dawn version, was the Thoth Tarot, designed by British occultist Aleister Crowley and executed by Lady Frieda Harris, an artist strongly influenced by Italian futurism and other modernist currents on the art world of her time. Based on Crowley's Kabbalistic erudition and his new post-Christian religion of Thelema, the Thoth deck radically reshaped the imagery of the cards, and also broke with the habit of using medieval imagery for the cards. It was completed in 1944. The Thoth deck existed only as a set of paintings and illustrations in a book until the 1960s, when 250 copies of the two-colour edition with illustrations were printed entirely in blue at the back of the cards in red, was produced by the Sangreal Society, an esoteric organisation based in Texas. The year 1969 saw the first colour printing of the deck of limited quality. It was not until 1977 that a new edition made from the original paintings themselves brought the Thoth Tarot out in something close to its intended form. During the 1970s, new tarot decks began to come onto the market. In a steady trickle in the 1980s, the trickle became a stream, and in the 1990s, the stream turned into an overwhelming flood. As this writing scores of new decks find their way into print each year, to say nothing of the other non-tarot divination decks, most of them, at least, partially inspired by the tarot. There are tarots based on every mythology, from Chinese to ancient Mayan, every spiritual tradition, from Wicca to Zen, and every artistic tradition from cave paintings to the work of Salvador Dali, to say nothing of unclassifiables, such as the herbal tarot, the baseball tarot, the Alice in Wonderland tarot, the Lord of the Rings tarot, and so on. The literature on tarot has expanded accordingly, and followers of every Western spiritual tradition have access to texts expounding the philosophy and practice of the tarot in familiar terms. In all this ebullient growth, there have been a few dissenting voices. Some traditional Jewish Kabbalists and Jewish scholars of Kabbalist history, such as Gershom Scholem, have steadfastly rejected the idea that the tarot has any connection to the Kabbalah at all. In the same way, some modern scholars of playing card history have dismissed the occult dimension of the tarot as nonsense. Such views are correct in that the tarot does seem to have started out as a clever addition to playing cards, and nothing more, to define tarot forever in terms of its origins, though it is to approach it in a remarkably simple-minded way. Over more than 2 centuries since it was first adopted by occultists in the late 18th century, the tarot has been steadily reworked and developed by those who saw its occult potential and were not afraid to being that potential closer to reality. Whether or not the tarot was originally connected with the occult, in other words, it certainly is now, and the contributions of many occultist diviners and magicians have gone into making the modern tarot one of the most important elements of Western occult tradition. So, the way I see the tarot is that it's a universal occult system that incorporates all Western mythological archetypes into its language, basically. And that's why I think the tarot particularly appeals to so many different people from all over the world, because it has that, though it is a very Western thing, it has a lot of universalism in it, which I think people from all over the world, whatever region or ethnic or racial group they're from, can relate to it very well. So the tarot is really something if you're into the occult, I recommend you getting into first before you practice other systems, because it really does, it's very broad in its language, rather than, and I'm not saying that the runes or the Ogham aren't, but they're very more specific to a particular regional language, which can be quite hard to understand if you're, from somewhere very distant in the world. So I'm going to go on and now discuss the runes. So the runes, a group of ancient alphabets used by Germanic and Scandinavian peoples as a system of writing for practical purposes and as a magical and divinatory tool. The oldest known system of runes, the Elder Futhark, of 24 letters, apparently originated sometime before 50 CE, the date of the oldest known runic artifact. The term Futhark, used for a runic alphabet, is made up of the sound values of the first 6 letters. An expanded version, the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, of either 29 or 33 letters, was in use by 400 CE. Among the peoples of Scandinavia, by contrast, the runic alphabet evolved in other direction, simplifying into the younger Futhark of 16 runes. Scholars have argued for more than a century about the origin of the runes, with Greek, Latin, and Etruscan alphabets being suggested as the original source of the runic letters. It's clear, however, that runes were deeply connected with Germanic magical traditions from the beginning, as the meaning of rune suggests. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his account of the German tribes, the Germania, written in 1998 CE, mentioned in passing a system of divination using notae, signs. Pieces of wood from a nut-bearing tree were marked with the notae, and 3 of these were drawn and interpreted. The first known runic artifact, a brooch found as at Meldorf in Germany, dates from around 50 CE. So Tacitus' comment may be a reference to runic or proto-runic divination. Later runic inscriptions, including the impressive runestones found across southern Scandinavia, also include magical words of power and long, incomprehensible passages, similar to the Nominae Barbara of contemporary magic further south. Norse sagas and other written material from the last years of the runic tradition present the runes as a magical through and through. And the god Odin is credited with their discovery. Rune masters, called Arila in the time of the Elder Futhark, apparently played a major role in the magical and spiritual life of the Germanic tribespeople of the Age of Migrations, as their later Norse equivalents did until the Christianization of Scandinavia in the 11th century. With the coming of Christianity and the Latin alphabet, the runes gradually dropped out of use. Runic inscriptions from the Middle Ages often include elements from classical, Arabic, and medieval magical traditions, showing that the native magic of the North was fading out of memory. By the beginning of the Renaissance, rune lore survived only in fragmentary form in a handful of manuscript sources. The rediscovery of the runes began with the work of the great Renaissance scholar and magician Jonas Boreas in Sweden, who put the tools of contemporary classical scholarship to work on the surviving relics of pagan Scandinavian culture. Remnants of Anglo-Saxon runic lore also caught the attention of English antiquarians from the Renaissance onwards. The revival of the runes as a major presence in the Western occult tradition, however, began with the work of Guido von List, the seminal figure in the modern Teutonic revival. In 1902, while recovering from an eye operation, List underwent a mystical experience in which the runes played an important part. Out of this experience, he devised a somewhat idiosyncratic system of 18 runes based on a passage from the Elder Edda, in which the god Odin recounts the runes' secret powers. The system remains popular in the Germanic-speaking countries, but has had little following in the rest of the world. Another dominant figure in German's runic studies was Friedrich Marby, who developed a method of runic yoga as part of a complex and impressive system of rune mysticism and magic. Rune studies in the English-speaking world, on the other hand, progressed little until the rise of the first major Teutonic pagan movements in the early 1970s, and remained a concern of very few for some years thereafter. The publication of Ralph Bloom's The Book of Runes in 1978 changed the situation. While Bloom's work has been harshly criticised as shallow and inaccurate, it served to introduce the runes to a widespread audience and created a market for more substantial studies of rune lore. The decades since that time have seen a flowering of rune studies in conjunction with the development and spread of the Teutonic pagan revival. So the runes have been also a very big part of my spiritual development, and when I meditate upon them, there's this very intense, powerful energy within them, and I can't really explain it in words, but you have to experience for yourself to really understand. But the runes are very very much lifelong study, because each rune takes a lot of attention put into it. It takes a very long time to understand what it actually really means. A lot of the books on the runes that are out there, they only have a very almost exoteric explanation of what they are, and there is a whole deeper esoteric meaning to what they really are. But that is more something that the individual has to go in and looking for him or herself to really understand them. But on my path, the runes have played such a significant role. They accessed so much blood memory within me that I can remember past lives I couldn't remember before, and I could remember even memories of my ancestors, because they do activate that if you have ancestry, Norse, Germanic or Anglo-Saxon ancestry. They do activate things within you. So now I'm going to read out the Ogham script. An archaic alphabet used in Ireland, Scotland, and Britain for inscriptions on standing stones and other surfaces. It consists of 20 regular letters formed of notches cut across one or both sides of the edge of a standing stone or any other line, plus 5 additional letters with more complicated shapes. It was traditionally written in vertical lines, starting from the bottom. According to the 14th century book of Balamot, Ogham was invented by Ogma Sunface during the reign of Brice, son of Elfar, king of Ireland. The first things ever written in it was the letter Beaf, repeated 7 times on a piece of birth, as a warning to Lug, son of Ephelua, that his wife would be carried away into fairyland. An alternate account in the same source complains that it was invented by Fenus Sadia, along with the Irish language, shortly after the events of the Tower of Babel described in the book of Genesis. There are 2 different versions of the Ogham, called Boya Belaf and Beth Luas Nyan, which differ in the names given to the letters and the order of the several letters in the first series. Both of these names are also used for late and rather clumsy secret alphabets, clearly derived from the English alphabet, while the Beth Luas Nyan letter names are all but universal in modern pagan practice. The Boiler Bealoff letter order is the most common, and there is a good deal of confusion between the two. The old Irish sources give a wide array of symbols, phrases, correspondences, and metaphors for the different Ogham letters. Examples include word Oghams, in which poetic phrases represent letters, so Ogham, in which different colours and locations of pigs represent letters, fortress Ogham, bird Ogham, colour Ogham, and church Ogham, all of which use names of words beginning with the letter in question. Dog Ogham, in which from 1 to 5 dogs of different types stand for the letters in the series, and so on. Different ways of writing Ogham, many of them deliberately confusing, are also to be found. All of these seem to be methods of secret communication which allowed trained bards to weave hidden messages into their poems for other bards to read. The first surviving traces of Ogham date from Ireland in the 5th century CE, where it was used on gravestones, while conventional historians are agreed that it must have been invented shortly before this time. There is little evidence for this claim, and the alphabet may have been used on more perishable writing materials for centuries prior to that time. References to Ogham in Irish epic poetry dating from pagan times suggest that it was commonly used for magic and divination, as well as for more mundane purposes. The spread of Church Latin drove Ogham out of common use by the early Middle Ages, but it survived as an element of traditional bardic lore until the hedge schools of Ireland were forced out of existence by English repression in the 18th century. Therefore, thereafter, it was an obscure curiosity, unknown to a handful of scholars until 1948, when Robert Graves' apocal The White Goddess introduced it to a wider public. Graves drew connections between the Ogham and traditions of goddess worship, and also linked many of the Ogham's letters to a 13-month calendar. More recently, the Ogham has been converted into a system of card divination, and at least 2 Ogham-based decks are available as of this writing. The Ogham has become a standard element of the lore and most modern Druid traditions, and is very widely used in other neo-pagan traditions inspired by the Celts. So, the Ogham is a system I've very recently discovered. I knew of it obviously before very recently, but I never really deeply looked into it like I've have just very recently. So I at the moment don't know as much about it as I do with the tarot and the runes, but I am actually engaging in study of it at the moment, and it's a very interesting system that links to tree lore, and tree lore is the metaphysical understandings of the spirits of trees, which do have souls. The trees have actual souls like animals do. Obviously, like a blade of grass doesn't have a soul, and not all plant life has souls, but they are spirit, but they don't have a soul. But trees actually have a soul, and that the Ogham goes into detailed tree lore about this. Obviously, I don't have much information on it at the moment because I've only recently started using it, but I am continuing my study into it and my practical usage of it. And the Ogham script has, relates to my Irish side, my Irish roots, and there is also that, that deep ancestral connection I get to it from the runes, like I do with the runes. So that's that's what I got to say about the free divinatory magical systems that I use. They're the three ones I mainly use, and I use them in a way that what is tailored for my own individual expression, rather than what someone in some book about these systems has written. Because I think a lot of books on these, on the tarot, the runes, or probably even the Ogham, don't are pretty much all very much the same, in the sense that, and there obviously are differences and variations, but you're going to get roughly the same thing. What you have to do is, the books are all good and well, but you have to use it on your own spiritual journeys and see how that manifests and how that comes to light, because that's the only way you're going to know of these systems. Reading books of it isn't enough. You've got to really be practical with them and be and have your own individual interpretation of these things. And obviously there will be similarity to, someone else's individual interpretations, but that's because of the archetypal feeling and of each archetype within these systems. But the overall, but your own individual experiences with these systems is very much yours, and you've got to kind of have your own story linked with it. Because if you're just trying to follow someone else's path of these systems, then that's not you following your own spirituality. That's just you trying to imitate someone else's spirituality, and that's that kind of way of doing things isn't going to work anymore, because we're moving into a time where things are going to become very, very tailored to individual expression. I'm not saying that, that there isn't going to be any communal or collective action or anything ever for what's coming, but it's going to be more individualized, because the current, obviously, for trying to collectivize spirituality isn't going to so much work with what's coming, if you know what I mean. It's got to be your own individual outlook on these things. And that's not to say that you can't have similarities with all these various esoteric or occult arts, but you need to take into consideration that you need to now start creating your own spirituality, because all these organized religions, they've been trying to carve a spirituality, trying to create a spirituality for a collective of people to just follow and not carve out their own. And that's what organized religion really is. It's the control of a collective of people's spirituality, of a collective spirituality, to then basically control them and herd them like sheep. That way of doing things isn't going to work anymore, and because we're moving into a new age, the age of Aquarius, which relies on individual thinking and individual action. And so I mean, this is things I need to speak about, but yeah, I mean, I don't know all the systems out there. I mean, I'm only presenting 3 esoteric systems out there, but there are a lot more than what I know. And I don't know all the answers to everything. So, but I just wanted to share, knowledge from from one of my books, my book collection on the stuff, and then have my own analysis on it. And my well, it hasn't really been analysis; it's just been me telling my own experience, my own experiences of these things. I can't obviously go into detail of all my experiences of this. I read the stuff out by my book collection these for the past few videos is because it does give you a good information. I mean, some of the stuff that I actually read out in that book just then, I am very skeptical about. For example, I think what they say about the Ogham script and the runes only going back that far, I think they go way back further than that. I mean, the runes in Ogham script are very, very ancient, and they didn't just rise in the Bronze Age Europe. They go back, far more than that. And also, I have disagreements about the tarot when they say that the theory that I can't remember his name now, but that theory about it being from ancient Egypt, and they say that it ended up false. I think actually that does have origins in ancient Egypt. I think there's been a lot of trying to debunk that effort to debunk that by other occultists who want to make it out that it's that because that gives us a lot more credibility if it's from ancient Egypt, if it's from that far back. Obviously, it probably looked very different, and it might have had things added onto it, so it might not be exactly how it was, but I think it was very much ancient Egyptian connected. I also had a theory that it's also Vedic connected as well. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't looked too much into it, but it wouldn't surprise me, to be honest, that it also has Vedic roots as well. It does interest me that the Egyptian theory that I have is because when we got understood about ancient Egypt, it was very universalist in its way of um, in its way of its own magical and spiritual traditions, because maybe not at the beginning of ancient Egypt, but certainly for a long period of time in ancient Egypt, it was actually very much a multiracial society. It wasn't just, obviously you had the native Egyptians there, but you also had Europeans coming in, people from Europe coming in. You had people from Africa coming in. You also have other groups in the Middle East coming in. So you had all these different races and ethnicities of people from all around the world in the ancient world crossing of Egypt. And I think that a lot of the ancient Egyptian stuff is very universal. And I've plenty of people subscribe to my channel who are from all different races, but they seem to all have this what do you call it, this link, or this kind of ancestral link or memory link with Egypt. And that does interest me because I know people who are of European origin, of African origin, of even Middle Eastern and even Asian origin, who all have this connection with Egypt. So there was it was something quite Egypt was something quite central back in the ancient world, and there's been a lot of repression on ancient Egyptians' history that we're not told the full story, and it goes back far more ancient than it says in the official records. I can tell you that now. I've looked into both mainstream and alternative sources for this, and I can say now that it does that the whole official narrative of it going back to only 3000 BC is a load of shit. It goes way back, more further than that. And the runes in the Ogham script. The runes are, I think, have Proto-Indo-European origin, and the same with the Ogham script. The fact that they say only goes back to these things only go back to the late Bronze Age is just absolutely false. I can tell you that now. It started developing a lot earlier than that, going back very ancient. And the fact that they like to say that these things didn't develop, only developed in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age or whatever, is because they want to make it look like humans only started to become intelligent enough to be able to put these systems together at a certain particular time, but that wasn't that long ago. The fact is that the human brain hasn't actually been growing for thousands and thousands, in fact probably even a million years. It was still the same size, so it didn't have any our intelligence has been more manipulated by, obviously things I won't go into now, throughout the years, throughout the ages, more than it becoming more stupid or more. And obviously you can look on this all on an individual level, but what I'm saying is that it's more manipulations of our consciousness that haven't allowed us to access this more than our level of intelligence. And so what I'm basically saying is that these systems of the occult arts, whatever their origin is, are extremely ancient, and they may not be in their absolute pure form, because there has been a lot of corruption with these systems due to firstly the repression of them, and then the revivaling of them. And during that repression and revival time, there's been a lot of changing it or not understanding it in the pure sense. And obviously this has a lot to do with the suppression of the church in general, which is going around the world suppressing a lot of this knowledge, taking it back, and kind of not fully understanding it and trying to work with it in a very different way, which wasn't the way the creators and inheritors of it used it. So even now, and this is why I do say that this is why we have to have an individualistic approach to these systems. It's no good just following someone else's dogma, like I just said on this, because that is the only way we're going to purely get back to the pure meaning of these of this ancient occult language, which we have lost for some years, but now is reviving back. And so our individualistic outlook on it will help. But I also think that it's important to discuss these things with other individuals who are deeply into this knowledge, because then the truth will come to light. Because if we all tell the truth, what we think is the truth about this knowledge, then the truth will reveal itself amongst a round table of highly initiated individuals on these systems. If you understand what I'm saying. Because remember, what I mean by the collectivist outlook on it is very different from a number of individuals coming together at a round table and discussing this. A collectivist output will be one or maybe a few more people on up on a podium saying to a crowd what they think this is. That's collectivism. What I mean is in a round table of individuals, and there's no master above truth. And that truth will be the master that will reveal what these secret languages of the esoteric and occult metaphysical worldview are. So I'm going to probably wrap up here. So I recommend to anyone to look into these systems that I just mentioned, because they are of very sacred knowledge, but they need to be handled with absolute respect, because if you pervert them, then I'm not so much worried about what that's going to do in the outer world, but I'm more worried about the implications you're putting on yourself. And this is why it's important to look into the stuff in the most with the most sincerity possible, because this knowledge is not some, just a hobby. This is actually serious sacred, serious information that should be handled with absolute respect. And that's all I've got to say for now. Thank you for listening.